Welcome to Ancient Geeks, a podcast from a couple of geeks of a certain age who examine geek culture from the perspective of their childhood when geek was niche, till up till now, to it's become more mainstream. We were geeks before it was chic. I'm your co-host Stephen Taylor.
And I'm your co-host, Tom Grant.
Welcome to Ancient Geeks, where this week we're talking about classic Doctor Who. Which, what does that mean? Because there's lots of doctors. So I think we're going to talk today. I know we're going to talk today about really the first five doctors. Is that we're agreed upon,
I
Tom?
that those are the rules of engagement this
Those are the rules of
episode.
engagement, right? So as we're trying to be a little more clear about where we're coming from in the podcasts, recognizing that we have our own secret language and we know what we're talking about, but maybe the readers or the listeners don't,
Yeah,
right? So like the parameters we're trying to work with here in these early episodes in particular are looking back at really our childhood up through
yeah.
high school graduation, more or less, and that means a little bit of two different time zones. For me, it's I graduated in 1986. Tom, you graduated in 1980, correct?
That's correct.
So, a lot of this is about the 70s, but it's a little bit about the late 60s and a little bit about the early to mid 80s and trying to get a time frame for all this stuff. And of course, when it comes to a property like Doctor Who, it's not necessarily about when it was on the first time, but when it was on for us,
Right,
right?
right.
So and let's also sort of delve into a little bit of sort of background. Well, let's do this first. What's the theme music for the episode before I talk about background?
The theme music we can't afford to put on.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, or at least we're too scared right now to play clips. I think we can get away with clips,
yeah.
but we'll figure it out one
Well,
day.
I would say it's the classic Doctor Who music,
Absolutely, it's the
which
wheels
which
and the da da dunts.
which they had very early on. I mean, it is classic in the sense of being there from the beginning.
It very much is. No, the basic structure of the theme music for Doctor Who has been there from the very, very
Hmm.
beginning and just persists in various formats and more interesting adaptations in the new Who era than in the old Who era. Although even then they did to do some variations. But let me do a little background about the property, and then we can talk about our encounter with that property, right? So Doctor, for those that are unfamiliar with Doctor Who, although I'm presuming that if you're listening to this episode, you have some idea what we're talking about. But
Well,
just in
who
case,
knows? They could be people who are interested in
who
other things
who
who
knows?
came, they came for the Marvel comics and Star Trek, and they're staying for Doctor Who.
Works for me. Let's hope that's true. So, Doctor Who, right, is a British television production that first premiered in
Hmm.
November of 1963. In fact, it premiered the day after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, so making it an inauspicious start. Kind of got lost in the news of all that was going on at the time. It was in continuous production from 1963 to 1989, and it went on a hiatus. There was an attempt in 1986 to revive it in a partnership between Fox, the Fox Broadcast Network in the United States, and the BBC that did not produced anything more than one singular movie, and then it returned in 2005 and has been in production ever since. And
Hmm.
we're actually rapidly approaching the 20th anniversary of the revival of the property. But it is, and while we're not going to talk about anything past the Fifth Doctor, it's worth pointing out, right, that it's been a continuous story. It has not been a reboot or reformatted. It is the same character, the same basic background, and the same lore throughout that entire period of time, right? Um, the show, when it was first conceived, was supposed to be kind of semi-educational. The idea was this eccentric time-traveling scientist and his companions could go in various places in time and space, including the past, where they could explore, historical activities and events, and as well as do some fantastical science fiction kinds of things. An important part of the story, right, is that the Doctor, who is an alien Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey, can, when gravely injured, regenerate into a new body and also with a new personality. This, of course, was a clever production technique used when the first Doctor, William Hartnell, was becoming too old and infirmed to perform his duties and had to leave the show. And then they decided to recast him with Patrick Troughton, and instead of trying to just duplicate William Hartnell's performance, they created basically a new character, and this sort of transformed this property. And right now we're on the 15th Doctor, and of course
Hmm.
there've been 15 Doctors plus some other sort of unnumbered Doctors, and the suggestion there might be even more Doctors. It's all
Doctor,
uh,
Doctor, give me the
give me the
news.
news. I gotta yes, precisely. So the show itself followed a weekly format of Well, one, when it was initially on in the UK, it was a half an hour program each week. It was serialized. They would be self-contained stories, usually four, five, six parts, sometimes longer, sometimes occasionally shorter. When broadcast in the US, they were usually putting these more multi, like hour and a half omnibus episodes, sometimes containing one story, sometimes still split into multiple parts. Um, but every story is basically the Doctor and his companions and their space and time ship, the TARDIS, which is a time machine that can also travel in space and is bigger on the inside than on the outside and looks like a 1960s police box, which is basically like a phone booth for those. And again, all these references, if you're young, what's a phone booth? Just think about a wooden box. It's blue.
Hmm.
And each week, they're solving problems for whoever they're encountering. It's kind of like my notes are. It's kind of Space Columbo meets Route 66, or various versions of shows in the 70s, like The Incredible Hulk, where Dr. David Bruce Banner is traveling from town to town, fixing problems and then running away again.
Hmm.
So let's see here. It's a show that has well, again, it's quintessentially British, but it's become a worldwide phenomenon. I think it fits our show quite well, or the podcast, because it really was a property when we were kids that was very, very much geeky, right? It was very limited in its audience. It was not widely known. Most people wouldn't know what it was. Yet by the time it comes back in the 2000s, especially with the 10th Doctor, 2006, 2007, 2008, it becomes a worldwide phenomenon and really becomes a much more popular property. And now it's co-produced between Disney and the BBC and is clearly a world property. So it's transformed in that regard.
Well,
And
maybe this is a good
yeah,
point to inject where we first
yes, let's
saw
do it.
Doctor Who, which was on, drumroll please, PBS.
Yes,
So
the
not only
power of
were we weird kids who were watching things like Masterpiece Theater, but we were also kids who watched a lot of other British television that came through PBS. Doctor Who, the Monty Python's Flying Circus was on PBS.
yes.
The Prisoner, a little bit more of an obscure show, but a great one. Anyway, so there were all these, not exactly, I would say, like the A-list sort of shows that came from the BBC, but this is really, Doctor Who's like a B movie, and
Yes.
this, yeah,
No, the PBS thing is exactly right. It's for me, PBS. You're revealing yourself to be more highfalutin than me. I did not watch Masterpiece Theater, but um, PBS for me was
one.
first. It was
Once again,
Sesame Street.
once again you're dead to me. So
I
that
know
happens once per episode, and this is
the
it.
but as
We
we've
got that
learned,
behind us now.
as we're learning, I can regenerate. Despite my death. The PBS was first, like Sesame Street and the Electric Company, and then it was these weird shows I could find at 10
Yeah.
o'clock on a Friday, which of course was a place that a geeky child might be who wasn't going to go out and do things on a Friday night. Um, but yes, you're right. Doctor Who, although in this case it was actually on the afternoons for me on a Saturday. Um, but yeah, and we've mentioned Blake Seven before in passing in other cases. And whatnot. Anyway, so yes, it was an odd place to find it. It was also for me an early encounter with having to use the VCR sometimes to be able to watch this program. Once I had gotten
Right.
a part-time job, the only way to watch things was to record them, and all of the anxiety that went along with setting the VCR and hoping no one messed with it in the house.
Yeah. I taped it too because it was on, I think, in the afternoon, in the market, where I lived in Southern California.
Yes,
So I wasn't necessarily back from school yet or had
right.
time to watch it or whatever. So yes, the VCR got used a lot for the show.
No, I mean, I think for me, I mean, I know we were both in California, although I'm presuming you must have encountered it before that I did. I'm pretty sure I first saw Doctor Who. It would had to have been no later than 84. It probably was 1984-ish. And it was probably on Channel 50, and it was on Saturday afternoons. And I just remember very distinctly with my siblings being home that day and having sort of found it. I'm not even sure why I turned it on because I really didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
And it was the first episode, Robot, with Tom Baker, the Fourth Doctor, and I watched it from there and really fell in love with it very rapidly. How about yourself?
Yeah, I came in somewhere in the Fourth Doctor era. we're going to talk a lot about the Fourth Doctor undoubtedly, but I think that really defined Doctor Who for me. And
Yes.
it wasn't the giant robot. It was just maybe a couple of storylines later, though. It
Mm.
wasn't much later than that. I'm not sure I would have been as engaged with the show if the giant robot had been the first experience, because I don't remember that being terribly good. But
It, it's not the best episode, I think, but the thing about it, and of course, I've expressed before that a lot of these properties often grab me because of the promise that there's some thing you can find out, right? There's not just
yes,
not even a mystery, but like there's a lore and a world to understand. I did not because it starts off with the third Doctor regenerating into the fourth Doctor, but I really didn't know what I was looking at. And in fact, if you
right.
John Pertwee, the third Doctor, kind of looks like lying prone in profile, kind of looks like Tom Baker. So I'm like, is that what I don't understand what's
Oh,
going on here?
yeah, I can see where that'd be confusing.
And
Yeah.
no, and then but then there's the whole like, but the characters are clearly reacted to him having changed, and this whole thing about him, you know, coming out of this fugue state that he's in, and all that, and then learning who what unit might be and who's the Sarah Jane person, and the
Hmm.
robot was in some ways secondary.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so maybe I was being a little harsh in my statements about the giant robot episodes, because there were very charming elements of it, and that was actually a lot of the appeal of the show, was these kind of very charming characters you had around the Doctor, aside from the
Yes.
Doctor himself. I just remembered which was the first episode. It was the Ark in Space.
Okay, that was very soon there. That actually that maybe the one right after that.
Yeah, yeah. So they're in an Ark in space, and there are these bug-like aliens
Yes,
who are trying to take over. And
the Weirin, I do believe.
yes, the Wirren. I had them on my list of good Doctor Who villains.
Okay. So that, yeah, and then like I said, from there I watched it incessantly. But after a while, the VCR became important because I ended up getting a part-time job and girlfriends and or a girlfriend actually. And then here we are.
Yeah.
But
Well, and I would say
so
the other thing about this is that at the time, watching it on PBS was the only place you got anything Doctor Who related, right? There really wasn't any footprint outside
no,
of watching the episodes. There weren't, tie-in books or comics that were available then, at least where I
no,
was.
no.
There weren't other bits of merch. It just was kind of its own thing on TV.
No, in fact, I'm not even quite sure when it was I realized that there were, in fact, he was one of multiple iterations of the character. I do
Yeah.
remember the first time I saw Peter Davison, the Fifth Doctor, was a picture on a magazine at Lone Star Comics and Science Fiction in Dallas, Texas. That sort of like, oh, there's something else to learn here. But yeah, there was no, I mean, again, we make the joke, but kids, and kids in this case would be someone like even in their mid to late 20s. There was no Google to go look this stuff up, right? There was no
No.
way to even know. It was just really, it was a distant thing. It came from a distant land.
Yes.
And this idea that just whatever you got's what you got. And it was a very different experience than media now, where if somebody mentions something, you can find out on IMDb how many episodes there have been, when it was first
Mhm.
published, and created, and what have you. And that was just not the case then. It was a very different world.
Yeah, and it even in like the specialty science fiction and fantasy magazines at the
Yes,
time, so for people who don't know that, there were things like Starlog
yes,
and Ciné Fantastique and so forth. If there were any ink spilled about Doctor Who, it was pretty minor.
yeah. I think I do recall maybe seeing something about Doctor Who and Starlog, but
Hmm.
again, you're right. It was because that was mostly Star Trek and Star Wars and whatever and else was going on, Buck Rogers and Battlestar Galactica and etc. So yeah, it was really, I mean, it really felt incredibly niche at the time. And even
Yeah.
people that liked science fiction might not have watched Doctor Who. Because I mean, it was not well, the special effects were not that great. It was
What?
I know it's shocking. The Viren was so lifelike. I mean, when the robot got big, it was so impressive.
Eh.
I felt like I was there.
Brr.
It was the effects weren't great because it was taped or filmed in this 30-minute increment thing. So there's a rising and falling motion every half an hour and with
Mm.
semi cliffhangers, but it drags itself out. It can be, I'm sure we'll talk later, it can be very ponderous. But so it took a certain kind of taste. You had to be a real geek to want to watch Doctor
Yeah.
Who.
Do you want to talk about what we liked about it now?
So
Is
yeah,
this
so
a
what
good
was it?
segue?
What is it? Yeah, that's a great place. So what is it that appealed to you about the program?
So I would say it's something that struck me many, many, many years later. In fact, it was just the other day when I was putting together notes for this episode that a lot of the appeal of Doctor Who reminds me of the appeal of the old British TV show, The Avengers.
Okay.
So The Avengers, if people listening to this don't know it, it was a spy show that was done during the kind of the height of interest in spy movies, spy TV shows, James Bond, Man from Uncle, things like that. And is this was done in a very British way. It was all about a particular style that the show tried to evoke. It was a show, I think, about classiness, not class, classiness.
Right. Right.
The two main characters were pretty darn cool in their very different ways. There was a female agent, Mrs. Peel, and a male agent, John Steed, and just Steed was a kind of a much more traditional British aristocrat sort of person with a bowler hat and a umbrella, and Mrs. Peel was sort of like a modern mod sort of character, in pantsuits who would like kick the crap out of people with karate. Um, but it was just sort of lovely and charming in a way that's very difficult to describe as imperfectly as I am right here. There were lots of character actors who showed up who were really good in the show. It was also very episodic, and it had an earnestness to it, in spite of the fact that
Yes.
it was tongue in cheek. Um, I would say the other thing that really reminded me of Doctor Who, it's a topic for a later podcast, and that's going to be the sort of the monster movies that you would see on TV at the time that we were kids and teenagers. So you'd see things like them or uh, Giant Mantis or whatever, which were also these B efforts that were very earnest. They had a very limited budget. They tried their kind of do their best with telling a story and making it fantastic and having crazy ideas played out on the stage on the stage on the screen. And I this both the Avengers and the monster movies just to me kind of sit in that same space in my brain with Doctor Who. And a lot of the things like we're alluding to about Doctor Who, which were again charmingly earnest, that they had somewhat cheap sets and padded out episodes, and they couldn't afford to have a lot of actors, so Doctor Who and his companions would go to a planet, and the population of the city maybe was 10.
Yes. Yeah.
You didn't see a lot of people. They would like use the same sort of locations over and over again. Quarries were really big at Doctor
Lots of
Who.
quarries.
Lots of
Yes.
quarries, lots of industrial buildings and so forth. But they were really trying because like the writers definitely wanted to be as out there as they possibly could with the limited means that they had. One also thing they had surprisingly good monster makeup during the Fourth Doctor era when I started watching it. Some of the aliens were really great.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Absolutely. No, I think to me the appeal. I really like characters like the Doctor whose main superpower is that they're smart.
Yeah.
That they're there to apply logic and science and cleverness. I also like sort of the eccentricity of the character, which it varies obviously. I mean, Tom Baker in particular was very eccentric, sort of mercurial and sort of funny, but also commanding and was able to solve these problems and save the day. Right. That's always
Mhm.
appealed to me. I think I mentioned Space Columbo, and that was not at all to be a slight. That's one way I like Columbo. Columbo's just smart. Columbo doesn't have
Yeah.
to. He doesn't have a gun. He doesn't, beat it out of you. He figures it out because your teeth match the cheese that you bit into during the whatever was going on. And I'm not making that up. Anyway, um, so that kind of character, the Sherlock Holmes kind of character, in some ways, that's another comp that's often
Yeah.
made about Doctor Who, that he's like Sherlock Holmes. I think there's some truth to that. So I think that was the main appeal. And I mean, some of it, the kind of thing that like I just thought was cool. Like again, the TARDIS is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, and it can travel
Right.
anywhere in time and space. This is quite a wide universe, and then figuring out over time, no pun intended, that there was in fact, like with Star Trek, a lore that could be learned and understood, the
Mhm.
different monsters and creatures and what have you. That was all very exciting and interesting to me as well.
Yeah. But if the lore wasn't too complicated, it wasn't like trying to be a Marvel Comics reader today and unpacking like all the complex relationships, within one super team like the Avengers or the X-Men, and how characters had changed over time or how villains had changed over time, and passing references to special storylines that happened 30 years ago. It wasn't like that at all. So,
No,
okay,
that's
he's a
that's
time
true.
lord, there's Gallifrey, he got in trouble with them, go. You
Right,
didn't need
right,
a
right.
lot more than that. I mean, though they did have, I think, with some of the recurring villains, I think the deeper sorts of plot lines, like especially with the Daleks, who were the
Yes, yes.
iconic villains of the Doctor Who universe.
Or the Cybermen, who really have at least, I forget how many origin stories now that are often somewhat contradictory, but that's okay.
Yes, it's like
Um,
Watson's war wound. It kind of moves around a bit. Speaking of Sherlock Holmes.
yes. So what are your thoughts about these five doctors? What was your experience beyond? Okay, so you saw the fourth Doctor.
Hmm.
Then what happened next? Because it
Yeah,
wasn't necessarily the case. It goes chronologically with
yeah. I mean,
PBS.
yeah. So I was watching Doctor Who. I mean, it was I think sort of the time of the fourth Doctor was perfect for me to follow it. It was on PBS on a predictable basis. It was on at a time where I could catch it live, or might not have to worry about it if I VCR'd it for later. I hadn't gone to college yet, but of course, then when I did go to college, my priorities changed, and so I missed originally a lot of the end of the fourth Doctor period, and then I came in a little bit with the fifth Doctor. I maybe have watched like a couple of episodes, and then I just realized I couldn't keep up at the time. I
Right,
was just too busy
right.
with college. But then eventually I did get the time. I went back and watched some of the John Pertwee, the third
Hmm.
Doctor episodes in particular. I didn't see much more than that. And then you gave me the homework of going back and watching more of the
That's
one
right.
through five. And I did so. So I went back to like the first Doctor, the second Doctor, uh, the three Doctors episode,
Hmm.
where all three incarnations of him that had been around at the time showed up. That was a regular storyline. Like they would do these special episodes where, the Doctors from different times would, kind of intersect with each other.
Yes. So yeah, like I said, I started surreptitiously with the first episode of the Fourth Doctor and watched all the
Hmm.
way through. And I'm pretty sure that then they went to the fifth Doctor. But I know after the fifth Doctor, they went to the third Doctor on PBS. So I ended up kind of going
Oh,
back in
interesting.
back in
Huh.
time before they started showing the sixth Doctor, which would have been probably in terms of actual chronology would have been being had just been produced in the UK because
Right.
I believe that the Sixth Doctor shows up in either 85 or 86. I looked it up and I've forgotten now. But so right around when I graduated from high school, it had in fact moved on. I know that when I was at that point when I was watching the Fourth Doctor in the US, the Fifth Doctor was being made in the UK. So there was some,
Hmm.
but again, in those days, you never knew if or when or if I guess what was being produced over there was ever gonna you were gonna get to see it, right?
Right.
Um, because there was just no way to know. But so yeah, I'd gone back and I watched the third Doctor. Um, Pretty much, I watched pretty all of the four, five, and three in whatever order it came in, pretty much in its entirety, mostly because of the VCR. Because, like I said, at that point, I was not home on Saturday afternoons. I did at one point. A friend of mine's uncle had a bunch of, I don't know where he taped them, but he had some Second Doctor episodes on VHS, and I watched some of those. Um, and then I don't know when I finally saw. I mean, I had a smattering of experiences with where I had bought some videotapes. They were VHS tapes at the time, and a couple of DVDs later of earlier stuff. But it was hard to get, very hard to get. And that most would have been later, not during this formative period. The formative period, really, my only experience really with the first and second Doctors were with in the three Doctors that you mentioned, and then the five
Hmm.
Doctors, which was the anniversary special when Peter Davison was the Doctor. But anyhow, so but I really did have a deep experience with three, four, and five. And four, as they say, was my Doctor. That's the one that I still think of as in some ways the best Doctor. I do think some of the modern Doctors are in the same category with him, but but the fourth I thought was just like I said a minute ago. He was smart, but he was funny, and he was mercurial. In some ways, he was kind of alien in ways that maybe some of the
Yeah.
other ones were not as much. I enjoyed that quite a bit. Um,
Well, they really played up the British eccentric with the Fourth
oh,
Doctor.
yes,
He
yes,
had a floppy hat, an impossibly long scarf, just kind of like a random way of talking. He just come out with something out of the blue that was
yes,
weird but appropriate, as it turns out, for the moment. He was kind of a trickster, a little
yes.
bit.
I can see that. Sure.
He had a sense of humor. He was sort of like a serious trickster. That's what I put in my notes here. It's like
Okay.
he could flip between very very serious if that was the moment to be that, or be very very jovial. It was an interesting character for the Fourth Doctor. I mean, I think again, so much of this is about how charming the main
Yes,
characters were,
yes,
and his sidekicks were pretty good too.
yes,
Sarah
yes.
Jane was just a nice young woman, who wasn't just a shrinking violet in the story.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. No, she's portrayed, in fact, as being, at least for the time, something of a feminist.
yeah, and she got her own show eventually too for a
Yes,
brief period. Yeah, I think
she
that's
did.
testament to just how I think independent a character she was.
Yes. No, they tried to spin off with her and K9 that didn't go anywhere. That may have been in the 80s. And then there was later, because she came back and was in the new series in an episode, which became then I think a three-season show, The Sarah Jane Adventures.
Yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, Liz Sladen died fairly, yeah, I mean, she was in her 60s maybe,
Hmm.
which, especially for a show called Ancient Geeks, is definitely young. Um,
Yeah.
but I did not check the age, which was unfortunate,
Yeah.
though, really unfortunate, because I think she's one of the all-time companions in my mind.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But so, well, we'll just. I probably should have gone first to fifth, but I started with the fourth, so I'll go fifth next. What was your
Okay.
impression of the fifth Doctor?
I didn't like him that much.
Okay.
He just seemed, I don't know, a much more serious guy.
Hmm.
It just for me, he was okay,
Yeah.
but like if you just got British actor who was in a lot of TV shows at the time, which he was. Like I
Yes.
remember him popping up in other things I'd been watching from British television.
Yeah. I
You
think
know,
he
I
made he made his name in All Creatures Great and Small.
Yeah, and it was okay.
Yeah.
What did you think?
I find him. Yeah, he's a bit boring, is what I wrote down in my notes.
Yeah.
He's likable. I but he was definitely a definite change of pace from Tom Baker. I think also the fact that he was at the time the youngest actor to play the part, he then sort of they focused kind of on his serious side, which I don't sure
Hmm.
was, but it was. I mean, I find that era fine,
Yes.
and that's
Just
about as
fine.
it's just fine. I I mean, not to range too far into the outside of our window of discussion, but I mean, I don't know that he's my. I don't really rank the Doctors in terms of 1 through 15. I kind of have categories, and he's just in.
Hmm.
There's a bottom category. He's in the bottom category for me.
Yeah.
Um,
And its companions were not that, at least like the episode that like the series
yeah,
that I watched,
yeah,
they were not that interesting. There was that kid, Adric,
yeah.
who
So
was
he,
kind of annoying,
yes, and he
to be
started with
honest.
Tom. He had started with Tom Baker. In fact, so he got Nissa. And Tegan both show up at the very, very end of the Tom Baker era. Adric had been with the Tom Baker Doctor for over a season. But yeah, it was, I agree. I think the Fifth Doctor era suffered from the problem of too many companions.
Yeah.
Over time it varies. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two. But when you get more than two, in my view, it usually means there's enough time then for the Doctor to do stuff. But even two can be a problem sometimes, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
But
So, yeah. So enough said about number
yeah,
five, I think.
I will say one other thing that goes outside the scope of the discussion. I was going to mention it later, and I may still talk about it a little bit. There's a whole mess of audio dramas, like decades worth of
Hmm.
audio dramas. They're very good. If you like Doctor Who, I recommend them. Um, some of them, some of them, the characters or the actors, I think, transcend what they were given on screen.
Hmm.
I think the Sixth Doctor, who we're not going to talk about today, is actually far better in audio than he was on TV, and I think it's because
No,
just
that's
better
interesting.
scripts.
Huh.
Far better. Davison kind of bores me even on the audios, and so it's just like, just sort of plain. He's plain vanilla, is what he is.
He's sort of
Let's.
like the Rock Hudson of Doctor Who, right? Yeah. Handsome looking guy, and as an actor, he's okay.
He's okay.
He's okay.
So we can kick it back up to the. So did you watch any of the first Doctor, or do you only
Yeah,
have?
I watched the first episodes with the Daleks, and maybe we should explain something about the Daleks
Let's talk
too.
about the Daleks, sure. Which start at the very beginning. They're in the second serial, and they have not gone away.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Daleks are this really interesting alien race that you know the lore way better than I do, but they come from this planet that was irradiated during a massive war, and they put themselves into these. They're not exactly robot bodies. They're these. How to best to describe the shape of a
So,
Dalek?
a pepper pot.
A pepper pot? Okay.
They're often described as pepper pots.
Yeah, or a salt shaker,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, with arms on them that do particular functions, but they're just the single-minded evil race that pretty much wants to eradicate
Yeah,
anything
they're
in their
they are
way.
like they're like super Nazis trying
Yeah,
to exterminate their way through the universe. So yeah, they're from the planet Skaro, and there was a war between the Khalids and the Thals.
hmm
And then the Khalids, which is Dalek spelled backwards, very clever,
hmm
um, uh, mutated into this form because of the radiation. And in fact, it was created sort of as the next step of evolution for the Khalids, and they put themselves in. They're basically like tanks, right? But they're these
yeah,
little gooey looking um, one-eyed aliens that live inside the outer shell. Yeah, and they've got the weapon, and they've got which is an energy weapon on one, and they've got the plunger looking thing on the other.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and the actual living Dalek inside the machine's almost like an invertebrate.
yes, yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
so they're kind of horrific
yes. Oh yes.
to begin with, and they're just as I said, they're sort of unstoppable, but also they just don't care.
No, they don't care.
It's like like when the Borg were originally on Star Trek, the first episode where there wasn't a human face to the Borg at all. It was this
That's right.
sort of collective entity that just had no engaging properties. It
Right.
was just this relentless force that would just roll over you if you gave them the opportunity. And that was the same with the Daleks.
Yes, they're an unstoppable or nearly unstoppable killing machine who just simply wants to eradicate all life except Daleks because everyone else is tainted in some
Right.
capacity.
Which might make an uninteresting adversary, but actually they were interesting in a lot of the stories. And I think that's a credit to some of the writing in
Oh yes.
Doctor Who is that they took this otherwise kind of been as might have been as flat a character as like a slasher and a slasher movie and turned them into something much more interesting.
Well, they definitely have staying power, and as you know, as noted, they were in the second serial. The serial itself is called the Daleks. They used to have individual names per episode. They stopped doing that
Hmm.
around the end of the first Doctor, I think, or into the second Doctor, regardless. But they were created by Terry Nation, who was the same guy that created Blake Seven, to make that connection, and who, wrote a lot of the Dalek stories. And but they've persisted, right? They're iconic,
Hmm.
and they continue to the
And
present
they're just
period.
they're just weird. There's nothing like them. Like
That's
they're
right.
immediately recognizable when you first when you see them later, and when you first see them, it's like, what the hell is that thing?
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah. I mean, the amazing thing really is, I mean,
Yeah,
there have been some evolution, but really they look largely the same even in
yeah.
2025 as they did in 1963 or 64, whenever that came
And they
out.
have the same buzzing monotone
Yes,
voice
yes, yes.
and the
And
iconic line "exterminate."
they exterminate. Yes. It's something that's all that they say, which is actually, I mean, there's some scenes where there's a whole bunch of them just saying exterminate. It's actually pretty scary, especially if you're a kid.
Oh God, definitely when you're a
Yeah,
kid.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And again, that's why I want to say it's like this is a lot of the appeal of Doctor Who is based on stylistic elements,
Yes,
like the Daleks are
yes.
so different, so weird.
So the first Doctor was he was just a grumpy old man. Did you watch the one with the very first one, or just the Dalek
I
episode?
watched the Dalek episode.
So the very first one's an Unearthly Child, which actually is a serial, which I will admit I have never watched the entire serial because after the
Hmm.
first episode, which is actually pretty interesting, they go to Stone Age times and it's kind of boring.
Hmm.
So at any rate,
Lots of walking
uh,
around.
lots of
There's
walking
always a lot of
around.
walking around because they got to fill up time.
I mean, I have watched some, but I don't know if I've watched all of it. Maybe I have. But and it's worth pointing out for anyone who cares, right? You can get all the classic Who on BritBox. That is the source if you unless
Hmm.
you're going to buy it from somebody. Um, but I think one of the interesting things to me about the first Doctor is he really was not designed to be the central hero character. He was the motivator of the story because he had the TARDIS, and the TARDIS traveled in space and time, and he was obviously this mysterious figure who was in some ways kind of you mentioned mischievous. He was, he definitely was not cooperative. If you watch some of the first season in particular, he's frequently at odds with the other characters in the Ian in particular, the school teacher, but Barbara, and is kind of almost antagonistic towards them. Um,
Well, he's kind of a jerk in the Dalek episodes.
yes.
Like
Oh yeah.
he just says, I want to explore this alien city, which turns out to be a terrible idea.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And,
Yes.
and, and he just kind of pretends
That's
like,
right.
oh, we're out of Mercury, really need this to run the
That's right.
TARDIS.
That's right.
His the TARDIS again is his space and time ship.
Yes.
Anyway, what are you gonna do except go to the city and see if we can
That's right. No, that's
score
right.
score some Mercury?
He wanted to hang out. They all wanted to go home, and he was like,
Yeah.
"Nah, I want to do what I want to do."
And I think in
Um,
general, like that's something that makes the Doctor an interesting character. He's in the different incarnations, he's imperfect.
yes, that's true.
He makes
That is
bad
true.
decisions often. He often doesn't have the best motives.
That's right. That is true. That is true. Um, so let's see here. How about the second Doctor? What did you partake of with the second Doctor? There are by
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted
Yeah.
myself. I interrupted you at the same time. I will point out, I meant to at the beginning, one of the interesting things about the early serials are there are a lot of missing episodes because the BBC thought rerun, what's a rerun? And they recorded over a lot of shows and reused tapes. So it's like 97 episodes that are missing out of 26 different serials and the
Yeah.
two
I
Doctor.
watched I watched the well, I saw him in the Three Doctors. I saw
Yeah.
him in the War Games episodes I watched.
Hmm.
And again, he's not a perfect guy.
No.
And thank you for suggesting the episodes where we find out about his background more.
Yes.
Because then you kind of again see that not a perfect guy. He basically says, "Well, I stole this time machine because I was bored."
Yes. Exactly correct.
what did you think of the second Doctor?
So the second Doctor, again, when I first saw him, my first encounter with the second Doctor was in the Three Doctors or the Five Doctors, whichever one I saw first, which is okay. So this is I at that point had read about the other doctors, but I hadn't
Hmm.
seen them on screen. So I mean, he was just like, oh, he's the space hobo. That's what they always described in the books, and
Hmm.
he's kind of jovial. He's Charlie Chaplin, whatever. And I have not watched again. Some you can't watch. Some of they've reanimated. Some they haven't even done that too. I've watched a good chunk of the Second Doctor adventures on BritBox. I've come to appreciate what Patrick Troughton did with the character, which was if it weren't for Patrick Troughton, there'd be no more Doctor Who, right? Because if that whole regeneration thing didn't work, then there wouldn't have been a third Doctor. But
Right.
and also the second Doctor is really more the central hero character. I think that the first Doctor was kind of evolving towards, but because Troughton was
Hmm.
more spry, shall we say, than Hartnell, and not as infirmed, that it changed the character in a way that allowed it to grow and evolve, and it would continue to do so after he left. I find him more than I used to think. I think he's quite pivotal to the series, at least from a historical analysis point of view, and I think he does a really interesting job with it. He did that he and whoever else was doing the work at the time sort of recognized that he didn't have to have the exact same personality as the first Doctor, which I think
Yeah.
made him more compelling and like in some ways like many other incarnations that manifest in different ways. He at first can come across as kind of a bumbling goofball, but he's actually quite intelligent and will in fact figure out the problems and solve the problems at some point. But he's not Mr. Spock in the way he does it, to make a comparison.
Yeah, but
So,
also he had his own eccentricities, like what I saw from the episodes I watched was, he was distractible by things which didn't seem that
oh
important,
yes,
like where's my recorder?
oh yeah. Where's my recorder?
Yeah, it helps me think if I play the recorder.
Yes, and that everyone else did not enjoy.
Right.
I do enjoy especially in the Three Doctors, the banter between him and Pertwee is a lot of fun. This idea that
Yeah.
if you met yourself, you would argue with yourself, and I kind of like
Oh,
that whole
absolutely,
concept,
I
which
would.
is yeah. Uh, so Pertwee. So anything else about the second Doctor you want to talk
No, no,
about?
well, we can move on to number three.
Number three, or the fifth, depending on how we've done our order here. But the fifth Doctor to discuss,
Yeah.
number three. Um,
The third in sequential order.
exactly.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts about three?
Well, I've always liked him. I saw a
Yeah.
little bit of him off and on, in the old days. And he had a different style, right?
Oh
He
yes,
wore opera capes and ruffled
yes.
shirts,
Crushed
and
velvet.
yeah, I mean, he wasn't as grumpy as the second Doctor was. A little bit more jokey.
Yes,
Yeah, it was kind of a more of a fun guy. I mean, I kind of felt like looking at these now in retrospect, you could kind of see kind of increasing amounts of, again, joviality or
yes,
fun-loving aspects of the character and so forth come out. And I think that Pertwee was just maybe a step below where the fourth Doctor was in that.
yes. Well, yeah, the eccentricity stuff I think also gets sort of ramped up as you say, the way he dressed and the way he driving the old car and all this kind of
Right.
stuff.
And the
He
old car was exactly what reminded me of the Avengers,
okay.
because Steed also had the same kind of old car.
Ah, I did not realize that. Have you gotten the episode of Blake Seven where they have the old car in it?
No, I don't. I haven't gotten that far yet.
I just watched it again the other day, and I almost thought it was the same car, but I don't think it is. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's side note. Weird
Hmm.
old cars in British shows for hunting, Alex. Um, but yeah, I mean, Pertwee one, you can certainly see the James Bondian influence on the character at the time.
Oh, good point. Yeah. Yeah.
He is much more of he's the most active up to that point, and maybe in fact, in some ways, even over all the Doctors, he's the most sort of action hero of the Doctors. He's more
Hmm.
he'll do hand-to-hand combat, not all the time. He wasn't
Right.
like Batmaning his way through the Daleks or anything, but he would occasionally, you know, engage in little fisticuffs. more gadgets. Gadgets became, I think, more significant. Of course, the big initial thematic conceit of the Third Doctor is that he's been exiled to Earth and cannot remember how to use the TARDIS properly and doesn't have the dematerialization circuit that he needs to make the TARDIS go where he wants to go, and he's sort of chafing at this sort of circumstance. He likes Earth, he likes humans, but he does not
Hmm.
like being stuck in one place. Right.
Right.
To your point about the origin story about leaving Gallifrey because he's bored, I'm like he is not happy about being stuck.
Right. Yeah. So you have a lot of episodes that center around the Doctor and Unit.
Yes.
We haven't talked about Unit, which was this sort of special British Army unit dedicated to
Was it was the
defending
UN?
the realm.
It
Yeah.
was the
You. Oh,
UN
that's right.
actually.
UN. Right. That's
Yeah,
right. It
yeah.
was the UN, but defending the world against weird stuff.
Yes, that's right. They were kind of like the X-Files with guns. But
Yes.
yeah. Which actually were introduced in they were introduced in the second Doctor in two stories, actually the unit itself in one story, but then it becomes a central figure, the Brigadier, Sergeant
Right.
Benton, Captain Yates, and various other individuals over time.
Yeah. The
Um,
Brigadier was like a softer version of whenever Graham Chapman played a British Army officer on Monty Python.
it's- it's- what's all this then? Yes, there is some definite similarities with
Hmm.
that, without any doubt whatsoever. I do think about that sometimes. Um, and the Brigadier was a good foil for the Doctor because the Brig was very, very serious
Hmm.
and very straightforward, and the Doctor did not always want to play by the rules.
Right. In an understandable way. I mean, it
Oh yeah,
wasn't
that's
like
right. That's right.
with TV cops, like the the lieutenant would say, "Damn it, Mannix,
That's right. No, he was he was
you're a loose cannon."
he was occasionally right.
Yeah.
But yeah, he wasn't unreasonable. He was just that's a really good point. He was not a stereotypical sort of killjoy. That was not his role. He was
Mhm.
just he had a job to do and he wanted to do it the way that he thought it needed to be done.
Right.
And he would often roll his eyes at the Doctor, which is always kind of fun too, especially as time went
Hmm.
on.
Right.
And as he had to deal with the fact that he kept changing faces, which is kind of fun over time to watch this character have to deal with this. Oh, okay, so we're doing this again, are we? Okay, fine.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, so let's see here. So that's sort of a rundown of the Doctors. I mean, I think, I mean, for me, as I said, the fourth is my Doctor, and I think in some ways the third is probably my second favorite of this group.
Hmm.
Um, but and the others they're fine, all important in this history. But anyway,
Okay.
anything else about the character of the Doctor you want to talk about?
No, I'm happy to talk about other things, the
So
companions, the villains.
we already touched on companions. Talk about companions real quick. I mean, we already mentioned Sarah Jane. I think Sarah Jane is in the pantheon of the show
Mhm.
is an all time standout character. Um, what are the characters? What are the companions that you like or that stuck out to you from what you watched or remember?
Master?
Oh, the Master. Yeah, that's a
No, 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 no,
villain.
no, no, no. I'm
Oh,
saying
oh,
K9.
K9. Excuse me.
So there was a robot dog named
Yes,
K9 who was a lot
yes,
of fun. I mean, it was really the
yes.
most tongue-in-cheek thing you could possibly
Oh, yeah.
put into the story. This robot dog named K-9. Ha ha ha. But it was just again, it was kind of charming.
Oh,
So
yeah. It was
I
fun.
I love K9.
K9's great. Absolutely.
Okay,
Um,
what's another one of the companions you
So
like?
I always like Leela in
Oh
the Fourth
yeah.
Doctor. That was a good contrast because she was always one to slit people's throats, and the Doctor was like, maybe we shouldn't do that.
Yeah, she
Um,
was sort of like this, kind of pre-industrial society,
yes,
warrior woman.
exactly, exactly. Um, and I liked do you know the Fourth Doctor companion? I liked both Romanas, and it was
Yeah,
kind of fun for the Doctor to have someone who was at least in theory his equal and not some silly human that didn't know what
yeah,
was going on.
yeah. I like that too. Like the first Ramona, especially like
Yes,
the arched eyebrow, and
yes,
kind of
yes,
the icy stare, and clearly she
correct.
wasn't impressed by him one bit.
That's right. Exactly correct. How about any of the ones for the other doctors that you noticed?
Nah, not really. I mean, I liked who's the Scottish kid with
Jamie.
Jamie. I liked him.
Jamie's a classic, and he was a good companion. He worked really well. I think those actors had a good chemistry just
Hmm.
beyond, and he was fun. And unfortunately, a lot of his early stories are the ones that are lost. I'll pick on a couple more real quick and we can move on. I thought Susan was interesting in that she was his granddaughter, and that's never fully explained, at least not when she was with him.
Yeah, that was
Um,
weird.
yeah.
Yeah, because like in the first Dalek episode, she kept calling him
Yes.
grandfather. Really?
Yep. Yep. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
What have you been doing while traveling through space and time? Exactly.
It's made clear in the first episode that she went with him when he stole the TARDIS,
Okay.
and then she ends up getting not stranded, but she stays in Earth in the future at some point. She falls in love, and he basically kind of leaves her there without asking her permission, which is kind of weird. But anyway, I liked Liz Shaw, who was the third Doctor's first companion, but
Hmm.
she was only there for one season. I would like to see more of her, and I thought that Joe Grant was interesting, but a bit too goofy for me, to be honest. That
Okay.
was the other third Doctor companion, but I won't
Hmm.
go down a long list. Anybody else besides
Man, no,
those?
nobody comes to mind really. Again, I don't know as much about the earlier doctors as you do.
So I should have, and I didn't say. How about villains? Let's talk about. I didn't put that on
Oh
my list,
yes,
but let's talk villains.
I've got lists of villains.
Let's do it.
So do you want to do the worst or the best first?
But do the worst. I want to hear what your worst are.
Okay, so the worst of the ones I have seen, and there undoubtedly may be bad ones in a lot of
Sure.
the early episodes I haven't seen. Wang Chiang
Yeah. That.
is incredibly cringy. Oh my
Yes.
God.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Even
That's.
at the time, I was when I was watching it, in my teens, it's like this is really this
Oh
worst
no,
stereotype.
it's one level away from Mickey Rooney and Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's just
Yes, well
it's
said.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that was one. The giant robot, I wasn't really a fan of.
No.
Uh, the weird Frankenstein episode with the mad doctor Solon and his half-wit assistant Kondo. Oh God, that was not good.
Yeah,
Because it was such an obvious pastiche, but they
yeah,
didn't
yeah, yeah,
do anything with it,
yeah,
to
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
make it a little interesting. So
Right,
it
right.
was just okay. So that's Dr. Frankenstein.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
and the last those are the ones I put on my worst list. How about you?
God, I didn't make a list. I'm trying to think who the worst. I don't have a list of worst. I don't want to sit here and stumble around.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about the best because I think a lot of the appeal of Doctor Who is like the appeal of Batman. I think the villains
Oh yeah.
really kind of carry a lot of the weight. So whom did you really
So
like?
my top villain, and that's why I jumped the gun earlier when you said Master, was the Master.
The Master.
The Master is clearly one of my favorite villains, especially when he is introduced in the Third Doctor, when played by Roger Delgado, but that's I guess in this conversation, it's Roger Delgado against the Third Doctor. Then it's the emaciated Master against Tom Baker when he's supposed to run out of
Yeah.
regenerations and fights him in the Deadly Assassin and the Keeper of Traken and steals
Right.
a body and then fights the Fifth Doctor with Anthony Ainley. But I
Yeah.
like the
Well,
idea
we should
of
explain. Hang on. We should explain
sure,
who the Master is.
yes,
He's another Time Lord,
yes.
but evil.
Yeah,
Evil.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like the idea of a counterpart to the Doctor who was in fact a Time Lord,
Yeah.
who had his own TARDIS, who was doing sort of the opposite of the Doctor. Instead of solving problems and fixing things, was going around messing things up and causing mayhem.
Mhm.
So I like the
And they had good
Master.
actors who played the
Yes,
Master.
yes, yes.
All right. I also had the Zygons
The Zygons are good element.
because
Yes,
these are like hard to describe. Like if you like took an octopus and kind of squashed it until it was in
that's
human shape
yes,
is what they were. And anyway, there was a kind of an interesting story about them. Anyway, and just fantastic makeup. Again, it was like when I
yes.
saw that, I said, "Whoa,
Yeah, they were
somebody!"
shapeshifters, and they could, yeah, they were interesting.
Yeah. Okay, your turn.
I mean, I always liked the Cybermen.
Hmm.
Um, Probably, although it in the at least in this run, I really actually liked Earthshock, which is the Fifth Doctor story. It's probably one of the better Cyberman stories
Hmm.
in that run. I thought they're and also that the costuming was better than, but I enjoyed them in the Fourth Doctor's encounter and the planet, and also with the earlier incarnations, which you probably haven't seen when they were a little more
Dumpy.
rudimentary. Yeah, they were kind of dumpy.
Though the Cybermen are another sort of cyborg race,
Yes.
but they've looked just like more like traditional robots. And I'll take one issue with the Cybermen in the Earthshock episodes. The cyber leader said the
Yes.
word excellent way too much.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Yeah, yes, he did.
Yeah. All right. I'll pick Sutek, which
I liked,
was
yeah,
which was this ancient Egyptian god who actually turns out to be an alien, and he's in exile. That the other gods threw, or gods who were like super aliens, threw him into this place he couldn't get out of, and he's got human confederates who are trying to release him so he can devastate the world. Anyway, it sounds like the typical hokey story, but he was I thought a pretty menacing villain.
no, he was actually quite good because he was cast as, or I mean, he was described as having a great deal of power that the Doctor really had
Hmm.
to block. The Pyramids of Mars, which is the episode that he's in, or the serial that he's in, is actually one of the better ones, and I liked the way in which the Doctor's having to go between Mars and Earth, and the whole he gets to use the TARDIS some to sort of solve part of the problem. I like that quite a bit. But yeah, Sutek's a good villain for
Yeah.
certain.
I also liked, and I should have looked them up, and you'll know instantly, I bet. Who were like in the Fourth Doctor era, the microscopic aliens? Contact has been made, the ones that would like infect
Oh.
people, and they'd get like cottony things growing out of them from the infection.
I'm
I'm
blanking on that one.
sorry to throw you a curve
No,
there.
I've been
They
doing
were
pretty well about these things, but that one I do not remember.
yeah. All right. Any other
Unless
villains?
that's not the one about the plant one, the crinoids.
No, not that.
No, no,
No, it was something else.
don't remember.
Yeah, we'll find out later.
We've already talked about the Daleks. The Daleks are of course quite important.
Hmm.
Um, what did you think about? I'm not sure they're not on my best list. I'm not sure that they're not on my worst list. What about the Nestine when they're taking over plastic things, which starts with the Third Doctor? It comes back later actually, but they're kind of I don't know the fact that I never understood why their hands opened up and they had guns inside of them. It made no sense.
It didn't have to.
Fair enough. Didn't
It
have to
didn't
make
have
sense.
to. They reminded me again, like I'm going back to the Avengers, like there were at least one Avengers episode with a robot, like a killer robot that was played by Christopher Lee.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, it reminded me a bit of that. They were good. I have to say it was a surprise that it wasn't just robots, that there were these other aliens kind of pulling the strings,
Hmm.
I should say, behind these marionette bodies that they had created.
So I also liked in the Third Doctor had the Silurians, which were these reptilian creatures that supposedly they were had lived on Earth before humans, and then
Hmm.
there was the Sea Devils, which were their sort of underwater sort of cousins. Those were pretty interesting. I I liked the way in which they were like it was really in some way, especially later stories, trying to figure out not just really they were just purely bad guys, but like who has legitimate claim to the earth kind of things,
Right.
and
Yeah.
trying to sort those kinds of problems out rather than just being bloodthirsty bad guys.
Yeah. I mean, that was a neat idea that there was enough time in the age of the dinosaurs for
Yes.
something to evolve that would be a human level intelligence. And if they came back to, if they came into modern times, it's like, well, yeah, this is our world.
Right. That's right.
What are you monkeys doing here?
Exactly. 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 So let's see here.
Yeah. So
Uh,
lots of fun ideas for villains.
Lots of yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Any I'll also point out one thing that I liked. In some ways, the Doctor's own people, while are often not really good guys either.
Oh, hell no.
And that's sort of an interesting sort of conundrum. They're not like mustache twirling bad guys, but they their motives are questionable, and a lot of their own individual members of the Time Lord race do a lot of bad things. In some way, they make for an interesting foil for the Doctor. How about that? That I enjoy.
Yeah, and they have like the ethos in the early episodes of they're not supposed to interfere with
Yes.
anything that's happening, but that is like the prime directive in Star Trek. Is that necessarily a good thing?
No, it raises the ethical dilemmas, but also they say that, but then they'll often do what they want to do under certain circumstances, or they. And one of the interesting things to do with the Doctor, right, is well, we're not going to interfere, but maybe you could interfere for us, and that wouldn't be the same thing now, would it? But of course, it would be.
Hmm.
Um, which is part of what they do they tell the Doctor the Master's on the loose, but specifically in the fourth Doctor story, sort of move into maybe some episodes that stand out. One that stands out for me is Genesis of the Daleks, which is an origin story of the
Right.
Daleks. But at
Really
the
good.
you're really good, and at the beginning, the Time Lords basically do just plop the Doctor and Sarah Jane and Harry, the other companion, into this circumstance, and the Doctor is faced with this moral dilemma about whether he destroys the Daleks at their birth, kind of like could you go kill baby Hitler, and he ends up not doing it,
Hmm.
um, which was a pretty cool story, right? Not to mention the rest of it was actually, I think, also interesting and well done. But that moral dilemma that's presented is very interesting. Although after what happens later in the series, in some ways, maybe he made the wrong choice. But
Right.
anyway,
Hmm.
any other stories stick out to you?
I would say so. I mean, we've covered a lot.
Yes.
I'm struck for a moment that you as you pointed out that there is a show produced by Brits, written by
Yes.
Brits, acted by Brits, where the Time Lords, a superpower, do not always live up to their stated principles.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
hmm. Hmm.
Gee, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Again, like a lot of my favorite episodes really are kind of focused on the Fourth Doctor era.
yes.
Um, and I've mentioned a lot of them, particularly like some of the more interesting villains, like the Zygons and the Daleks, the Genesis of the Daleks. I
Mhm.
think that would probably be my favorite storyline in Doctor Who.
Fair enough. So, are there any critiques you have or things you didn't care for from the show?
Well, we kind of alluded to them, that sometimes it was a little bit of a chore to watch.
Yes.
Come on already, let's get to the next stage in this story. Like I didn't watch all of the episodes of of the first Doctor with the Daleks. There were like
Right.
10.
Oh
I,
no, you
I
can't. It's very
y-
difficult.
yeah, I mean it's okay. So where it seemed like there was a logical cutting off point, in kind of in the middle of the storyline. Okay, they've escaped from the city of the Daleks. The Thals are happy with them. Everybody kind of knows what the state of affairs is there. You can't trust the Daleks, despite the efforts of some of the Thals to say they could have some sort of cooperative relationship with them. It just kept going. I was like, oh, do I really want to watch more of this?
No, that's part of why I haven't, even though I've had access, I have not watched all of the early episodes. I've picked and chose chosen to some degree. But yeah, it has a certain ponderousness to it. I mean, part of it's the era, right?
Hmm.
I will never cease to be amazed when I watch older TV and even movies. Why are we watching a car pull up and park? I don't. Why are we doing this? I, and and like even things like
Yeah.
focusing on the wheel while it stops. I'm like, okay, cool. I don't know. There's some scenes like that in early Third Doctor stuff that I think about. Um, and I certainly would find it. I think it would be somewhat difficult for, say, someone to be introduced to classic Who if they've only watched the newer Who, which is more paced in a more modern kind of way.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly some of them are tough. I mean, the effects weren't great, but as you say, that didn't necessarily matter. Um, but it was certainly noticeable. Even compared to say classic Star Trek, the effects were not great. The makeup was at times quite good, though. You're quite correct about that. Um, but it was entertaining. It still is.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't really have a lot of critiques. Again, I think the show it bothered me at one point that it wasn't really science fiction.
Mm,
And I had a question about that. Like, is Doctor Who really science fiction? My feeling is not.
hmm
I mean, I could pull out the the much used Arthur C. Clarke quote
Right.
about any sufficiently advanced science will look like magic, but
Right.
you can't have that all the time, every episode. So the fact that it seemed unmoored from science often did originally kind of bothered me, and I kind of learned how to go with it, and kind of decide, well, maybe I just don't care, right?
Right.
Like in an earlier episode of this podcast, I was making the argument, well, we don't really need to have a boundary between science fiction and fantasy.
Mhm.
And if you want to do something that's science fantasy, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it then, and there was some brief conversation about it on outside the Beltway and in a comment section about this, and I realize it really is very difficult for me to come up with what the definitions are. It is this sort of vague sense of one has swords and magic and is somehow place bound, and the other is there's something sciencey about it and there's space involved. These are not particularly
Yeah,
useful definitions. I mean, I guess if I think if Doctor Who certainly is more science fiction than say the Lord of the Rings, it's less science fiction than say um, you know hard science fiction like the Mars novels of Kim Stanley Robinson.
right.
But I mean most to me, I don't know that as magical as the TARDIS is it any less magical than a warp drive or a transporter? It just to me it's almost the same kind of thing in some
Right.
ways.
Well, I think it's the question of whether or not the fact that it isn't trying to follow the rules of science as we understand it right now
Right.
means that there are no rules at all. It's not like in I think some of the worst Star Trek episodes where people invent monumentally world-changing or universe-changing technologies on the spot,
Right, right, right.
and just because the writers haven't figured out a way to get through a particular
Sure.
situation. Well, Argle Bargle will repolarize the hull and switch the antimatter emitters and blah blah blah. As long as there are rules, even if they're just sort of implied, it's also the same like with magic and fantasy stories.
Mhm.
That it's clear Gandalf can't do anything.
Right,
That you don't know really what the constraints are for whatever the
right.
magic is there, but you don't have to have it spelled out to you as a magic system the way
Mhm.
that some fantasy writers do. And the same here. It's like as long as they're just not pulling things out of their butts,
Mhm.
at a moment's notice to get through a particular sticky plot point, then I'm okay.
Right, right. Oh no, no, no. The phrase that comes to mind is reverse the polarity of the neutron flow.
There you go.
That's
Yeah. That much more eloquent
no.
technobabble than what I was doing.
Well, Doctor Who was very frequently reversing the polarity of the neutron flow. Anyway, anyhow, or just reversing the polarity in general. It's anyway. Regardless, yeah, it's well, we'll leave it at that because I think I've lost
Yeah.
my train of thought. Anything else about the show that you wanted to mention?
No, I mean, I'm ready to talk about merch if you want.
Sure, we can move on to merch. So
It'll
what
be a quick discussion because there wasn't any.
there really wasn't. There was some for me, but I was
Yeah.
again, I'm a little later in this in these conversations, a half a decade can make a big difference. The first merch that I came across, again, like I've said in other podcasts, was books, and
Hmm.
they were books by a guy named Peter Haining, and they were like coffee table books kind of thing. They were like bigger books. They were hardbound, and they were the first one I think that I had was called something Doctor Who, a celebration through time and space, or something like that. It's the first time I saw, okay, there were five doctors. Here's a list of episode titles and descriptions, some discussion of the TARDIS and the sonic
Hmm.
screwdriver and whatever else, and some of the monsters. So it was kind of a way to, I was able to learn about this universe, even though there were episodes I could not access. And there ended up being several of those over a period of time that I had anywhere from the early to mid 80s to the late 80s, which is outside of the scope of this conversation. But and then I did have a plastic TARDIS at one point. It was about I don't know 6 inches tall that I
Yeah.
think later one of my kids smashed when I had kids. So That's what kids do, man. They smash your merch. Um,
Yeah.
um, and there were a handful of videotapes that I was able to purchase, but that was maybe after the time frame in question. That was it. Was it something you would like to have had? Did you even think
Well,
about it at
I'll
the
talk to you
time?
what I did have because I had what there's a point I want to make about it. So Uh, we had a button machine at the bookstore,
Okay.
and we would just like regularly make our own buttons of things we liked. We'd make a Spock button, or we'd make an Adam Warlock button, or there you go, you're showing us your Human Torch button. And so we made up some Doctor Who buttons, and I think that that was pretty characteristic of the merch at the time. A lot of it
Yes.
wasn't necessarily where you were waiting around for the official
Right.
handbook of
Right.
the Doctor
That's
Who
right.
universe to
Yeah.
come or the official costume of the Fourth Doctor and so forth. You kind of built it yourself, right? And that was
Right.
true of like the costumes that people had at costume
Right.
contests at conventions. Of just for fun, people would make their own sonic screwdriver. If they had the skill and wherewithal to do that. That a lot of the merch at the time of when we were young fans really was homemade.
Yeah. Well, I mean, behind me, again, listeners cannot see, although
Mhm.
um, there may be some video available by the time you hear this. I've got some stills that I got at conventions
Mhm.
or at comic shops, depending. Many of which I think are probably things that people printed up themselves, having duplicated cells that they'd purchased or slides. But I've got the
Mhm.
three, four, and five up here on the wall behind me. But that was as close as it got. Right? It was hit and miss. There were like little trinkets you might could buy at the comic shop, but yeah, it wasn't a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, what I would have loved to have had at the time would be
Yeah.
Legos. Doctor Who Lego would have been like huge for me because I was
Oh,
a big
that
I was a
that's a
big
great
Lego
idea.
kid,
Hmm.
and I would love to have minifigures. Now, I do have some knockoff Lego minifigures now of the first to the 11th, but I don't think anyone exists after that that I've been able to find. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. But yeah, Lego's been great. I would love to have Lego. I made some of my own Lego stuff, I think, at the time because I was still kind of, well, not, but maybe early on I may have built a TARDIS out of Lego, but that was as far as it goes.
Yeah, I would have gone for a remote controlled K9.
Yeah, sure.
That would have
Or
been
a,
fun.
a big long scarf and a floppy hat.
There you go. Yeah. Which again, like we didn't have Amazon back then, so
Nope.
that would have been a real find if you got something that could pass for the doctor's scarf.
Indeed, indeed. Absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm surprised actually. Speaking of Amazon, so I out of curiosity, I looked at the state of Doctor Who merch today.
Yes.
At least that's available on Amazon.
Hmm.
As an obvious touchstone for what's available, since they carry so much of what is available in
Yes.
the world. I was kind of underwhelmed.
There's still, I mean, I have looked again. There was a video game that was linked to Lego that also they got some characters. I think there is a Capaldi minifig, but it's hard to
Mhm.
get a hold of. There isn't like though a line of definitely not a line of characters. I was looking at one point maybe for a small replica TARDIS. I mean, there are some examples, but it's not easy. It's not as easy as you think it would be to get.
Yeah,
So you're not wrong about that.
yeah. Like
Um,
I got my mom because she was a big Who fan. Years and years ago, I got her a TARDIS that made some noise.
yeah.
She was thrilled by that, and I got her a K9 on a different birthday. But there's not even a remote controlled K9 today, which would seem like a slam dunk.
Yes. Some of it, I mean, K9 at least, I wonder how much of it there's weird. The UK is different than the US, right? In
Hmm.
that the characters belong to the author that wrote the story. So there's like weird licensing things with all this stuff. Um, and I know there was some at one point about having K9 in the new Sarah Jane show, although she appears a couple times, but he's not like central. He's supposedly off in space someplace. It was because the owner of the license was trying to develop a cartoon someplace. It was just things like
Hmm.
that that are kind of
Oh, maybe
different.
that's the reason why.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because
It's
honestly,
interesting.
like a lot of the merch looked pretty shoddy. Like
Mm,
blankets
yeah,
with the
yeah,
Doctor Who logo on it that looked really
right,
cheap, and I don't know,
right.
it did not appeal.
No, I hear you. I hear you. I mean, I will say, and I will sort of plug because I think it's interesting or well done. So Big Finish is an audio production company in the UK, and they have the
Hmm.
license for any Doctor Who. I think the way the license works, it's anything except what's on currently on television. So they can do up through the 13th Doctor. In fact, they're about to release 13th Doctor audios, but they are full production audio plays with the original actors playing their characters.
Hmm.
They're very well done. Obviously, the first and second and third are not on there because they're all passed on.
Yeah.
But even Tom Baker, who for the longest time would not come back to do stuff, has done a whole bunch of episodes. They're all very interesting, very good. So that's something that if someone's interested in exists. Um,
And he had a great voice, so I'd imagine
yeah,
he would
does a
really
good
work
job
in
with that.
audio books.
They do the British still have a much more or had a longer term sort of love affair with radio drama in general, well
Hmm.
into the television era. So that is still present. Um, but they own a bunch of other they have license for a bunch of other property. They've done Blake Seven with some of the original cast. They've done prisoner stories, obviously not with the original cast.
Right.
They may have done the Avengers
Hmm.
and some other properties. Anyway, that's just a side note. And it's probably time to the hour stretches, so it's probably time
Yeah,
to
yeah,
say
enough free
goodbye.
advertising.
That's right. That's right. So we will leave it at that. Thank you all for listening to Ancient Geeks, and we'll see you next week.
See you next time. It's a big one next time. In closing episode 8 of Ancient Geeks, we just wanted to thank you for listening. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcast service of your choice. Please subscribe and leave us a review. We appreciate the feedback, and reviews help people find us, which is pretty important since this is a brand new podcast and people might not have heard of us. If you have some words for us, kind or otherwise, contact us directly at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. Look for us on Facebook, Blue Sky, and other social media outlets. All content copyright 2025, Tom Gren and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, whom you can find on Pixabay. We'll see you next time when it'll be nothing but a hive of scum and villainy here. See you then.